Good gardening class. This is class number 4, and or class number 2 if you signed up late, which is all right because everything's recorded. You can always go to professor-giles.simplesite.com, and a couple hours after we've done shooting it live, we have uploaded it there, and you're able to watch it off of YouTube. We're glad to have everybody here again today. And we were speaking yesterday when we closed about elements that affect your garden other than good dirt, which is, of course, rule number 1. Good gardening is good dirt. But you may have noticed by now that not everyone that has the same soil conditions has the same success. You may be trying to grow roses in your front yard and they're doing poorly. Yet your neighbor across the street is growing roses and they are going to town. Well, he may or may not want to share his secrets, but even if he does, one element that neither of you may be thinking about is the amount of sunlight you're getting. If he's successful growing roses in his front yard, that means he's getting afternoon sunlight. Afternoon sunlight is what must happen if you are growing most full sun plants. And when I say full sun plants, I mean practically every plant out there that you want to grow as a full sun plant. Trees are, shrubs are, vegetable gardens are, lawns are, flower gardens are. There are a few flowers you can grow in shade, but they're pretty inferior looking to the ones that take full sun. So, rule of thumb, between the hours of 11 a.m. at 5 p.m., you must have 4 hours of direct, unfiltered sunlight hitting that garden. Now, maybe you've already planted that garden and you're saying, well, I get all morning sun. Doesn't that count? Well, no, not really, because until 11 o'clock in the morning, sunlight is only about 40% intense. You need 100% intense. So if you're getting morning sun, that's good for shade plants, and it does a minimum amount for your garden, but it's not enough to make your garden thrive. What can you do? I've already planted my garden and it's getting shade in the afternoon. Well, if you're lucky, you can move a tree or something of that nature, an obstruction to the light. I guess if it's the house blocking the sunlight, you can knock down the house. Probably aren't going to do that for the garden. So one of the good things to do before you ever start a garden is plan the light. 4 hours between 11 and 5, direct sunlight. That's what you need for successful gardening, whether it's lawn, whether it's tree, whether it's vegetable or flower gardens. Now, some of you may have the opposite problem. You live out west, there are no trees out there. You have plenty of intense sunlight. Your problem is getting enough water to the yard because it dries out so darn fast, and you're under watering restrictions, which means you can't water as much as maybe the plants need. Well, for you guys, I offer a couple of suggestions. First being, before you start gardening there, you want to add a product to the soil, and you don't need a whole lot of it, but you do need to add what's called Moisturizer. You can't see it real well here, but what it is a kind of a foamy crystal that absorbs up to 12 times its weight in water. It holds it. So if you mix this in lightly with your soil, then when you do water, the water is going to stick around a lot longer. Remember Moisturizer if you live in a very arid climate. Another thing everyone could benefit from, but especially if you live in an arid area, is putting down a mulch or a ground cover. Shredded bark, hardwood bark mulch between the rows and over the tops of the rows, but not on top of the plants, will hold in moisture. You can also put down butcher paper over the rows and then put down straw. This will also hold in moisture far longer than just watering it into the dirt and letting the sun dry it out. Now in Israel, when they first took over that territory in the 1940s, they had vast areas of desert that no one had done anything with for a long time, and they had a quickly growing population they had to feed. neighbors were not going to come forward with food because they were enemies with all their neighbors. So they developed a system of underground piping systems where they were doing their growing. That includes orchards and fields of food. And what basically you do is you take a PVC pipe, drill some holes in it, then connect it all together and make sure it's waterproof at the connections. And then run water underground down those pipes, and it will soak the soil from beneath where the roots are. And you get by with far less water to grow the entire garden. It's kind of expensive, it's kind of extensive to prepare, but if you're an avid gardener and you plan to be gardening in that spot for years to come, and you live out in the desert, that's a solution to your problem. You can make the desert bloom by using an underground piping system. The other thing that you have to control is the pH. We talked about pH yesterday, but if you're not pH neutral for your garden, it's losing a lot of the food that you're giving it. And at the price of fertilizer, it's a good idea that you don't waste food. So learn to use the pH test kits and make sure that your soil is close to 7. If you're adding compost to the soil, that's making it more acidic. It's lowering the number on the chart, making it more yellow on the test kit. So you want a nice medium green when you do a test on that. If not, then you have to add garden lime. Garden lime either topically over the top and then watered in, or mix it in with the soil when you're preparing the garden. Will neutralize your pH. If for some reason, again, you live out in the desert and your pH is already high, you got an 8 or whatever, well, add some more compost to it. That will make it more acidic and bring it back down to a 7. But 7 is what you're aiming for. If you got a 7, your plants will be happy. If you don't, then you're off and you're losing food value. Okay, and let's talk about food now. What constitutes good food versus bad? Well, for you organic people out there, your food is for the most part good, but there are a couple of bad ones out there. And we started out with the history of fertilizers. Essentially, everyone for thousands of years just used urine. They'd water it down a little bit and put it on their crops, and it would feed the plant. If you have pet dogs, for example, now, females like to go out and leave a spot in your yard. You'll notice something about that spot. It turns brown in the middle, but along the edges of it, it's bright green and the grass is growing faster. Well, that's because the urine is very fluid. It burns the plant to death right in the center because it's too much. But along the edges of that burn is where the urine has diluted a little bit, and the plant actually took it as food. So organic feeding from the old days was very highly polluting, at least from the urine perspective. This, however, is how nature is always fed, and so technically it is an organic. Other good organics, for various reasons, I'm not as keen on as the industrial. But if you want to insist on sticking with an organic fertilizer that you can buy at your shop, crushed bone meal is a good one. It's a slow release, but it doesn't feed much, so you have to use an awful lot of it. Crushed cottonseed, same way. Very slow to release, does have nitrogen, but you have to have vast quantities of it in order to get enough food to the plant. Dried blood, that one releases pretty fast. It probably has the highest nitrogen content. But again, then you run into the same problem of it releases fast, and so it's feed now, starve tomorrow, and whatever the plant didn't eat goes into the groundwater. Those are the truly organic methods of feeding. Versus on the industrial side, we have improved the straight urine, which is 4500, by polymer coating it or putting sulfur coatings on it. Sulfur was the first. They invented 20-20-20 back in the 30s, and farmers still love the stuff. It releases all of its energy in halves. put it down, you water it, half of it releases now, and in 30 days, the sulfur dissolves in the other half. So it lasts for 2 months instead of one. But in both instances, it releases quickly and pollutes groundwater and tends to also leave salts behind from the sulfur. They improved that in the 1950s when they came up with polymer-coated ureas, which dissolve at varying rates. Perhaps you older people remember the old contact cold capsules with their tiny time pills that release over a 12-hour period. Well, it's the same principle here. The polymer is different thicknesses and dissolves at different rates when watered. So it releases some now, a little bit next week, a little bit next week for up to 6 months, depending on if it's a really good variety of polymer-coated urea or not. Well, that's been, in my opinion, where we got to go with all fertilizers is polymer coated. It's not terribly expensive, but it's a lot more expensive than the sulfur coated or pure ureas. Now, they've come up with an innovation since then, which is a microbially released urea. They coat the fertilizer with the polymer, but they also add a microbe into the mix, and the microbe feeds at a constant rate, a little at a time every day for up to 6 months. So it feeds at exactly the rate the plant uses it. None of the nitrogen or other elements in it are wasted. So it's the least polluting of all fertilizers, organic or inorganic. Isobutylylene diurea, IBDU. Problem is, it's expensive. Farmers won't touch it for that reason. Gardeners don't know about it. The last companies that manufactured it here, I believe, were Rockland, which went out of business, and Lebanon, which uses it for golf course fertilizers, if that tells you what kind of price you're looking at. Stuff ain't cheap. But if it lasts 6 months compared to 2 with the other fertilizer, and does no damage to the environment, doesn't salt your soil, doesn't pollute the rivers, I think it ought to be mandatory. I think they ought to pass a law against these fast release fertilizers on the industrial side and solve a lot of our pollution problems right off the bat, and wean these farmers from the notion, well, my grandfather used it, therefore, if my father used it, therefore, I'm going to use it too. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well, it is broke. They just don't realize it. They're salting their soil, and eventually it will be sterile. Then they're going to have a problem and realize they should have been using a better fertilizer all along. Also, we talked yesterday about last frost first planting date. I showed you this chart before, and not listening to my own advice, I've had my peppers out on the front porch now for a month. We've had 0 frosts all during March. That's very unusual. But last night, I forgot about the plants, and we had a frost. It was a mild frost, enough though to kill all the leaves on the plants. And these peppers I've had for years. So reminding you again, if you're above zone 8, which is right here in the orange, you need to wait until Mother's Day to permanently put out your plants. Elsewise, you have to watch the weather constantly. And if it's going to be a cold night, you have to cover them or bring them in. And a quick recount, zone 7, last frost is usually March 6th. Zone 6, last frost is usually March 20th. Zone 5, where I happen to live, last frost is usually April 2nd. Well, it happened on the 31st of March, so no surprise there, huh? And then further north, zone 4 is April 15th. Zone 3, April 29th. These are average dates. They're not set in stone, which is why I recommend erring on the side of caution. Do not put out anything delicate permanently until Mother's Day. Plant your permanents on Mother's Day. It's a good way to remember it. You don't have to keep track of all those other statistics. Okay, Now me, I have a bunch of things outside already in pots that have not even germinated yet, but they will. And I'm not worried about them if they're still in seed form, because as long as they're still in the seed, they're pretty much impervious to frost. Also, if you have a frost, there's a mechanism in the seed that tells it to wait another 2 weeks before starting germination. And if it's already started germinating, it will stop and wait. It's only when the plant's out of the shell that it becomes susceptible to frost. So since none of those plants outdoors have even sprouted, they're perfectly fine. And they'll be fine until they come up. When they do come up, we're going to run into some problems. The biggest problems are going to be pests. But we'll talk about that in a minute. Let me show you how to read a fertilizer bag real quick here. You might not be able to see all the writing on this, but I'll tell you what it is. All fertilizer bags or packages have 3 numbers. On the bag, it will have a first number, which is the nitrogen, that's the food. We'll have a second number, which is the phosphate, which is kind of like a sex hormone. It helps flowering and root growth. And a third number, which is potassium, the equivalent of vitamins for the plant. All the little things that we eat in a salad in our own diet are kind of like potassium to a plant. At any rate, these 3 numbers have some variance to them. The first number, nitrogen, there's a whole bunch of different kinds of nitrogen, some good, some bad. And the same with potash. There's 2 different kinds of potash, one that's good and one that's bad. Well, if you look at the fine print, it will outline for you the breakdown of each of those ingredients. For example, this is a fertilizer I highly recommend, Osmocote Plus. Its total nitrogen content is 15%. But if you read the fine print, 12.7% of that nitrogen is polymer coated slow release. That means it releases roughly 2.5% when you first water it, and then another 2.5% a little later, and so on for 6 months. And all the other ingredients in this as well are polymer coated. They release a little at a time so that the plant is getting the goodie out of it, not just one time or 2 times, but repeatedly over and over again for 6 months. Now, there are 2 kinds of potash. That's the third number. One of the kinds of potash is called sulfate of potash. That's the good one. However, if your fertilizer is using the other kind, muriate of potash, they won't tell you. They'll just call it potash. You're not required to say what kind it is. But if it does have the sulfate of potash, they'll use it as an advertising point for us people who know the difference in our potashes. What are the differences between muriate and sulfate? Well, sulfate comes from a mine. There's only 2 mines in the world that mine it. One of them, however, collapsed. So now there's only 1 mine in the world that makes sulfate of potash. And because of that, it's in keen demand, not only in gardening, but it's a key ingredient in making gunpowder. So you can imagine the price of this stuff is pretty high, and most garden places say, it's such a small part of the fertilizer anyway, we'll just give them the cheap stuff. The cheap stuff, the muriate of potash, and you'll never see that word listed on the label, they'll just put potash in there, comes from the great Southwest desert. At one time, that was an ocean, and it dissolved all of the potash in the ocean water. And when it dried up, then it delivered it to the sand surface. So you can get muriate of potash by the tons, just with a scoop and a sift or whatever. But it's also full of salt. And as I've said before, salt is a bad thing. So sulfate of potash has no salt in it, and it's good. Muriate of potash is full of salt, And because it's such a small amount, it takes a long time for it to build up in your soil. Some of the other fertilizers that you'll see in the market you want to avoid are very, very commonly advertised. And when I say very commonly advertised, everybody knows the name of this product, Miracle Grow. Miracle Grow is probably one of the worst fertilizers out there. It's full of salts, it dissolves quickly, there's no slow release in it. Although they have started carrying a sideline of products from companies they swallowed up that used to make slow release. But 99% of their stuff is bad. I have a motto about Miracle Grow, which is, it's a miracle if it grows, because it really is bad for your plants, bad for the environment. It's nothing you want to use on a regular basis. I recommend, if you have a bag of it, those blue crystals or whatever, save it for winter. It makes great sidewalk melt if you're trying to get rid of ice, but I wouldn't use it on my garden. It's just not a good thing. Now, since we have our bedding plants outside, pretty soon they're going to hatch, and after Mother's Day, when they're safe and they're growing well, we're going to run into a lot of pests, starting with some of them that we've already seeing out in the lawns, specifically moles and voles. If you got a bunch of lumpy places in the yard and holes coming up out of nowhere, those are moles and voles. If you're out west, they might be prairie dogs. But there's a whole family of these tunneling creatures that wreak havoc in your garden. Now, the mole is not doing the damage to the plants. What he is doing is he's going around your yard tunneling, looking for grubs. That's his favorite food. He lives there year round, and he feeds in the wintertime off of existing tunnels, but he digs new tunnels all during the spring and summertime, looking for new grub deposits. The grubs turn into beetles. The beetles later on attack all of your plants, but that's his food. The vole, however, is a smaller cousin of his and lives in the same tunnel with him. It's the only animal he will allow in there. And what the vole does is it goes around and eats all the roots that are growing into the tunnel, so that the mole has free passage to harvest his grub farm. He'll tunnel into your, the mole will tunnel into your garden, and the vole will devour all the roots. So between the two of them, they manage to do quite a bit of damage. A lot of people tried crazy methods to get rid of moles. None of them work. As you can see, this guy is playing whack-a-mole with his croquet hammer, trying to get rid of the mole. Well, that's about as effective as many of the methods I've seen for sale. You can't use sonic sound and shoot it at them and scare them off. Most of the poisons that you put in there in the form of poisoned peanuts or poisoned worms, well, if they're starving to death, they might eat some of those. Not all the moles will, though, so you'll still have moles. Why? Well, if you had a rich bounty of turkeys in your house, all frozen and ready to eat, why would you waste yourself with a fake turkey sitting over in the corner? You'd go after the real food. That's what they do. They like grubs. Okay, so if you want to get rid of them, you have to get rid of their food supply. This is done by putting down a product called Grub-X, which has to go down just as the grubs are getting ready to turn into beetles. So around the beginning of June or late May, you get the Grub-X, spread it out over the lawn, water it in really heavy, like an inch of water. You put it down just before a rainfall, if you like, save on some money. But that Grub-X has a very active poison in it that kills all the grubs down to about 3 inches deep. So it doesn't kill your earthworms because they like to tunnel down around 10 inches. Might kill a few of them that are near the surface, unfortunately, but it will not kill all of your earthworms, and they will continue. And the Grub-X toxin is very, very light, kind of like ether. It evaporates quickly. So soon after you water it in, it evaporates into the atmosphere and no residue of it is left in the lawn. So in that sense, it's non-polluting, but it will kill all the grubs. And if the grubs are gone, then the mole has to move on. And if the mole has to move on, so does the vole. So Grub X is the best way of getting it, getting rid of that particular animal problem. However, if you've already passed that date and the beetles have essentially turned, then you're not going to be able to kill them off, and the grub problem will not be the issue. They'll be eating off of the earthworms and other bugs that they can find underground. So another way to get rid of them is by taking castor oil. They sell this in products in nurseries, and spreading it over the yard. What happens then, the mole comes out and he steps in it when he's out making love under the moonlight, and the moles lick their feet. They get a raging case of diarrhea. Well, they have such a high metabolism for survival, they have to eat their body weight every day, that having diarrhea can be fatal to them. So if you want to get rid of them naturally and effectively, use castor oil. And they will, you might have to repeat the spraying of it a couple of times, but they will go away. They'll either move on to your neighbor's yard or die of starvation. Now, another big pest problem I have in the springtime when my plants are first sprouting, and this is true whether you went and bought nursery plants or grew your own, you've got them out on a table waiting to transplant them, and you come home one day and they've all been pulled up. Well, guess who did that? Your cutesy friend, the squirrel. Squirrels love to eat roots from plants, specifically tuber type roots, things like carrots or anything that makes a bulb underneath the ground. They love flower bulbs. They love bulbs from other plants that they can find, but they're not very good at horticulture. They don't know the difference between one plant and another. So what they'll do is they'll figure out that you're planting those things, and they'll follow you around and dig up whatever you had, find the bulbs in there and eat them. Then they'll associate anything you plant with that. So you might plant a whole bunch of tomatoes in pots. Well, they think, oh, okay, there's probably bulbs in all of those pots. So they'll go along, pull up each plant, look and see if there's a bulb in it. If there's not, they'll move on, try the next one. They can destroy your whole crop right there in the table without you ever even getting it into the ground. Chipmunks are the same way. You can live trap them, you can try and poison them, but there's an unlimited number of those things. They're just a pain in the neck. So I'm none too fond of squirrels for that reason, or chipmunks. Well, I'm getting the warning that we're down to our last 2 minutes. I still had a bunch of stuff I wanted to talk to you about, but we'll just go on to this. When you're weeding, if you want to make sure that you're removing a weed and not a valuable grown plant, give it a pull. If it comes up easily, it's a valuable plant. And what do you call a mushroom who is the life of your house party? It's called a fungi. And what do you get when you cross a 4-leaf clover with poison ivy? A rash of good luck. So whether the weather be cold or whether the weather be hot, whatever the weather, we'll weather the weather, whether we like it or not. You folks have a good day, good gardening, and I'll see you next week.